Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and economic growth and opportunity across America. This week, I met with Karen Evans, Washington, D.C. cyber leader and former Chief Information Officer for the Department of Homeland Security at the Prospect House here in Washington, D.C. Karen and I worked together as political appointees at the Department of Homeland Security and formed a great partnership between technology, finance, and operations. When you serve in government as an elected official or a political appointee, you need to focus on what you want to achieve, learn the organization quickly, and have realistic expectations. And lastly, align yourself with the right people. Karen was one of the right people. With almost 30 years of experience in the federal government, her background is very different from mine and provided a great complement to my Fortune 500 corporate experience. In this episode, Karen and I discuss federal cybersecurity, our SolarWinds Cyberattack experience at the Department of Homeland Security, and our experiences going through presidential transition. I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Karen. So good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, this is awesome. I appreciate you coming up to the Prospect House here and being able to kind of get back together. I know you and I try to get together every couple months or so, but it's very nice to have you in for the show. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm excited. I can't wait to get into the topics.
Yeah, our backgrounds are a little bit different. I came in from the commercial side of the Fortune 500. You came in knowing all the banana peels and everything that's out there on the federal side, and it was a great partnership.
I enjoyed working with you. We hit the ground running for sure.
Yeah, and then we definitely walked into some pretty big programs at DHS, financial systems modernization. We had an identity management. We had a couple Coast Guard programs that were pretty big that were hitting thresholds, and there was just a lot of different stuff going on. And I think when we got together, there was like a kind of a trifecta of organizations that really were working good together, I think, as a team. And that was the procurement side that did the procurement and acquisitions, yourself within the CIO area, and then within CFO. And that trifecta really was able to not only get things acquired for DHS, but also to make sure they stay on track.
Well, and I think that's the key to success in any organization is, making sure resources are there, that you can procure them, and that you're using technology in the best way that you can. Right.
And then, probably the last part, we'll talk a little bit about this down lower is, what I realized after you got out and we got out together, you have a pretty significant amount of public service that you do. And, I decided after I got out to stay in the Washington, D.C. area and work with a big company here. And, you're like the lead of a chamber of commerce. You encourage people to help out, and you actually got me involved with Partnership for Public Service, and I know we'll talk about that. But you have a lot of activity that you're doing with them.
Oh, I do a lot with the Partnership for Public Service. I try to do a lot of giving back. I used to teach senior executives the art of budgeting so that they, and project management, right? Because you saw it, how many really good project managers are there in the federal government in order to be able to deliver results?
That's right. And, it takes so long to, especially big projects, to get them on the strategic plan and to get them funded and budgeted and approved, and then to kick them off and get them acquired. So it definitely, that skill set's critical.
Yeah, and I'm specific about it's the art of budgeting, not the science of budgeting, because there's definitely a difference between the two.
Yeah. So, Karen, for the listeners, just to kind of fill in the dots, bigger picture that kind of got you here to Washington, D.C.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I get to talk about this. My father was a civil servant and retired out of the federal government, but he also did the mentality, and you would appreciate this being an IBM or Big Blue. It's what I call the Big Blue. You grow up in an agency, you stay in an agency.
Right.
And my dad wanted me to work while I was in college, so he got me to fill out all this paperwork. So I was a park ranger while I was in college, working at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. So whenever you want to go up and visit Troy, I can give you a walking tour.
I'm there.
I know, it's awesome. And so I did that, and then I thought, oh, I'll go into DC because I needed health insurance. And so I went into DC and said, I'm only going to do it for 5 years because my husband was going to dental school at West Virginia University. So another little piece about me is my husband and I met while we were in high school. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary. We're very excited. We have 2 kids. And we live in the same town that he was born and raised in. So he was never going to move toward Washington, D.C. So I thought, oh, 5 years, I could do 5 years. And here I am 30 years later, still coming into D.C. and working on a bunch of different problems or challenges. Because once you get the bug for public service, I don't think it ever really goes away. I think you just continuously figure out how can I give back so that the country ends up being in a better place for future generations.
So, Karen, in those early years, as you started to transition into federal government, it looks on the surface like a little bit of a risky move. You started also getting involved with some of the administration. So you get to a certain level where you have a reputation of a skill set, and then you get tapped by a current administration to say, hey, Karen, we could really use help. And, would you mind talking just a little bit about that? Because I know you've served in, I think, 2 presidential administrations.
Yes. So I started out as a GS2. When I was a park ranger, I was a GS2. The lowest you can go is a 1. And so when we enter into all these different talking places that you and I go, I am still probably the one who started the lowest out of all the people that you meet. But I worked my way up, and I became a senior executive, a career senior executive. That's less than 1% of the federal government population to achieve that. So in that right, that's successful in itself as a career person. But, so I'm gonna go back to my dad. He was the one who, when the Civil Service Reform Act passed in 1974, he established the Senior Executive Service, but he was only a 15. So I found his original file with all his notes and everything, and the congressional intent. And the congressional intent of the career ranks were so that you could step up and ensure easy transition, especially in critical areas like management, which you're very familiar with from DHS, like the Undersecretary for Management there. So that
Correct.
Those operations have to continue as transitions occur. So it was set up for you to step up and then for you to be able to retreat back. So I actually had guaranteed employment rights to go back. So if you start looking at it from a risk perspective, you're thinking like, oh, it's not really that risky. And the other thing, which is interesting for me, is I was under the old retirement system. And the old retirement system is like the gold retirement systems now, like what everybody always wanted to have. And there was a lot of incentives for us to change. And my dad told me not to change, so thank goodness. So it really came down to, are you ever going to be given this opportunity again? And there was a lot of discussion between my husband and I, because our whole career, and I think I've shared this with you in the past, when we got married, before we had to make really hard decisions, we decided that his was the number one career. So when I tell people that and they look at my career, they're like, you're the second career in your family? And I'm like, yeah. And so that really makes a difference, because the time to have that discussion is not when you both have a promotion on the table to discuss. So we talked about it very early on. And everything I did was always, my decision was always based on, am I going to close down, shorten my commute? Am I going to reduce some of my expenses? Can I get a free parking place?
Right.
And those were the kind of things I negotiated. But when I was offered the opportunity to step up in a presidential appointment, that was a big family discussion. And my husband asked me, are you ever going to be offered this opportunity again? Well, little did I know. I said, no, this is probably the only time this is ever going to happen. And his response was, well, then we'll make it work. So the whole family dynamic changed. And I took over a presidential appointment in the Bush administration managing the whole IT portfolio. And at that time, it was a lot, right? It was like $71 billion that we were working through. But the things that we were working through were implementing recommendations as a result of September 11th, right? Like reforming intelligence agencies, looking at, and so when you work on technology, everybody wants to jump to the technology because they really don't want to deal with the hard decisions of the business processes.
Right.
So that's why I got involved in so many critical decisions. Like I was involved in Medicare Part D when that was rolling out because it was a failure of the IT systems. But what it really was a disconnect in the way they negotiated the legislation.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting is, you talk about like even before the art of budgeting versus the science and, being in IT, the finance part of it is so critical. A lot of times driven by national priorities or events that end up happening that we kind of pull ourselves into modernization as a reaction. You and I saw that also in the pandemic and the post-pandemic, and definitely a big focus around supply chain and the resiliency and what happens if we have another hit in a way. What were you ready? So there's a lot of empirical data and then groups in DC that'll assess that and give recommendations. And you've been a big part of, now you're on the other side of being in administration and you're out in industry doing that and being able to help provide a background to that. And one of the areas, talk a little bit about, so you got out of the last administration and then you went back into cyber. You had been in cyber before you came into that administration. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your transition in IT to cyber and that kind of the activity that you had, and we'll kind of talk to current day.
Sure, and I appreciate you asking that question because a lot of people think like, why would you do something like that? And really the transition was more about people. And what we were doing and looking at all the information technology and why failures happened within the federal government on major IT, and people read about it all the time. I could go all over a list today and everybody goes, oh yeah, I remember that one. I remember that one. And it's all about the people. And when you start really looking at what was happening, and I looked over the landscape, I said, it's going to be cybersecurity. It's going to be the security of the data. It's going to be the integrity of the data. It's going to be the ability of our adversaries to get into our systems and manipulate data, or all of these different things. One of the biggest things that happened during my tenure was the VA lost a laptop with 26 million veterans' information on it. And what we learned from that experience was the person followed all the policies and procedures that were in place within the department. What happened was the laptop itself wasn't encrypted. And then what the other part was, he had it in his car because he was on travel. His car got broken into, it was stolen, and therefore then they got access to all this information. When you started looking at all the capabilities of what our country has associated with how can you exploit that information, it was eye-opening. So the whole concept of personally identifiable information and credit monitoring and all that, that all came from that one incident about what does the nation have to do as people start using technology more and more to be able to protect your own personal information. So that's why I went into really workforce. It was really about how do you get the workforce ready for the future. So we did things because I knew the government would be slow. So we launched a nonprofit based on studies that we were doing here in Washington, D.C., because it's all based on think tank work. You know how that goes.
Yep.
And we launched an effort called the U.S. Cyber Challenge, which was to show everyone that it's not the 4-year degree, but it's the capability, and that you could use competitions to measure people's aptitudes. And then you should then use the competitions just like you use academic excellence to qualify them for jobs. So that's what we worked on, and we actually got legislative change. I did that through the National Academy of Public Administration. We got the changes, we got scholarship monies reinstated for the Department of Defense, and was very focused on getting all different walks of life. Because if you believe there's a workforce shortage in cyber, which you read about all the time, and then you think STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, is going to fix it, and then you say we have a problem with attracting people into STEM, well, then we're never going to fix the problem. We're in an endless do loop. So that means we got to look at other disciplines, other people, other majors, and bring them in, because an integrated team is going to look at the problem multidimensional.
Yeah. No, something that I recognized when we were at Homeland Security is, we had that organization, CISA, within our group, within the portfolio as a component within DHS. And it was interesting as watching them, they would get a tremendous amount of money every year to try to take on probably more, IT and infrastructure policy, but they didn't really have a steady appropriation. And so as a CFO, I was always kind of concerned that they would get into a spending profile that they wouldn't be able to maintain. They were favored in Congress. Congress would plus them up and help them more than what we had as a department asked for, because, quote, cyber was really important. And but I'd also say that the CIO function shared that responsibility with CISA, and in being able to kind of make sure that there was kind of the sum of the pieces. And it was just kind of interesting kind of watching that. But I didn't know, what was your perspective of the kind of the integration with an organization like CISA, which a lot of people hear about in the news?
So DHS has a unique opportunity. And I highlighted this a lot when I became the DHS CIO. So my former job, which we alluded to, was I was, in essence, the CIO for the federal government as a whole. Yep. So I provided leadership for all the different departments and agencies for their chief information officer. So then I went back, obviously, and became a departmental chief information officer again. That particular one is interesting because CISA is supposed to lead the civilian agencies. DHS is the largest civilian agency. So in essence, CISA is supposed to provide me leadership, but yet I'm the departmental CIO who's supposed to govern their investments, because all my statutes that enable me are actually probably, there are more that enable the DHS CIO than actually enable CISA to do their job across the board in the federal government. I tell everybody, if I had another year, that department would have been, it would have been awesome, because that chief information officer had more operational authority that the secretary had put in the chief information officer. That was awesome to be able to execute. But the biggest thing that I think has to happen there is the CIO has to lead by example. Because when CISA says that there's a rule that they want to implement, then what the other departments and agencies, they will turn to the DHS CIO and say, tell me how you did this. And during my tenure, the CIO didn't talk to that group that was doing it. They dismissed that group, which is not appropriate. And so what I wanted to do when you and I were there is I wanted to be able to tell Department of Justice CIO, this is exactly how we're working with them. This is what we learned from that. There were things that the CIO was responsible for, which is now a government-wide program, which is the vulnerability. It's a vulnerability disclosure program, so your listeners will know it by like Patch Tuesday. Every time they get an automatic update, okay, those are the vulnerabilities. We piloted it at DHS CIO, and then I told my team, I want that implemented, and it needs to be implemented through CISA. And so we forced a lot of the integration, which CISA really liked. But that's helpful for the other departments and agencies because that's the role of DHS.
That's right. And for everybody out there, listeners-wise, CISA, for people that aren't out there, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So definitely, DHS is made up of about 23 components. CISA, or the Cybersecurity Group, is one of those. And like you were saying, I always found it kind of interesting procedurally that you were overseeing them, which was to oversee us. And, so it's kind of I also noticed with CISA, and not to get too deep into this, that a lot of, it wasn't just cybersecurity. It was, dams. It had to do with the industrial base and trying to be able to make sure where are the vulnerabilities in industry. And that organization did a lot of policy writing more than implementing stuff. They were trying to issue policy directives or suggestions to industry.
Well, it was a lot of partnerships. So they managed 16 critical infrastructure. So right before I came over to DHS, I was the first assistant secretary for cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response. And that job was established in the Bush administration, so that was my Senate confirmed job. But in essence, I was responsible for the security of our energy supply in the United States against all hazards, natural or man-made. Mm-hmm. So we interacted, we were what they call a sector risk management agency. So you interact with DHS, but when you really look at, if you look at the energy sector, the government owns none of that infrastructure. It's owned by private industry. So when you're talking about the guidelines and the policy, they have to really, DHS has to incentivize industry to actually implement those standards. The energy sector is I would say way ahead of most sectors because they've been responding to natural disasters for years. So they know how to work together. They know how to respond. I'm sure you were involved when Puerto Rico hurricanes came through, because FEMA is also in DHS. So FEMA has a critical role. I know everybody would know about FEMA. So all of us have to work when they talk about the whole of government approach. It's okay, here's the government bringing their resources, and then here's private industry. And that relationship has to work, especially when you're trying to restore power.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it was interesting just to kind of keep going through that while we were at DHS, big cyber attack right in the middle of that process. Could you explain a little bit to the listeners, this about probably mid 2020, we had the cyber attack, and just kind of give everybody kind of an idea. So that was the first time that I had actually had a direct experience in kind of a situation like that.
Well, I actually thought I was very focused on transition, and I was putting together all my stuff because, the chief information officer is probably not the number one issue that everybody wants to hear about when they come into Department of Homeland Security. So I wanted to make sure everything was working, and you haven't lived, and I should have known. Right? When the front office calls and says, is it okay if I give your personal cell phone number to, and it was a person in CISA, and it was a Friday afternoon, and I thought, oh gosh, because in the White House, you never wanted to be there on a Friday afternoon either, because you always got the assignments, right? So I knew it was something, and it was actually December 13th. Which is really crazy, right? But it was SolarWinds. So I know your listeners have heard about SolarWinds going through, but I thought, oh no, I have to, solar. And we knew because we were prepping, and as you may remember, in our team meetings, I was prepping everybody for, hey, we may have a problem, because I was reading in the press about FireEye had been compromised and they lost their red team tools. I told you guys about that. And then I told you guys, oh no, they brought in Microsoft. And I told you the next day they brought in Microsoft, hey, we're reaching out to those guys, because we had both of those environments. So I thought, oh, what's ever happening, we're directly affected. And then 2 days later is when we got the call. And we were one of 9 agencies, 9 departments. But what I will say is, because of my previous background about how all the technology systems interacted, there was a lot of stuff that we were doing behind the scenes to be able to verify, do I have to reissue everybody's badge? Because that wasn't a system that I owned, right? That was owned by the security officer. But all of those things were interconnected because Department of Treasury announced that they also had been compromised by the SolarWinds attack. And so how these systems all work with themselves within the government is great that I knew, because we could go really fast about who we needed to call and be able to put together a plan that we could actually squeeze the adversary out of our networks. Our internal name for this, Troy, and you'll like it, we called it Operation Squeaky Weasel. Sneaky Weasel. It was Sneaky Weasel. We were calling it Sneaky Weasel because we were talking about the FireEye thing anyway.
Yep.
But there was a whole other aspect of things that were going on, and we said, oh, man. So when you're modernizing, there's a downside to the modernization because that was the stuff that we had to deal with because of the modernization efforts within DHS.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's again, being the CFO, when you're sitting back and watching this go down, in corporate side, a lot of times, especially payroll systems where there's a lot of PII, the finance data a lot of times isn't helpful by itself. But I remember sitting in my office and, I think we were dealing a lot with the secretary's office at that point, and that we would get a list of the people that kind of had to be very careful, and you seem to always be on that list.
I know, right? I was always on that list,
Yeah.
and that's what was really funny, right? And so then when you start going through it, your team is looking at it, and we said, okay, well, we have to have a different way here to communicate because they're watching me, which makes sense because I would be handling the incident. So they want to see how much time they actually have in the system before we actually then are, systematically squeezing them out of the system. So it was, what I learned from that though, is once you have an incident, because I also had several incidences throughout my career, but my very first one was back in 1996, is that once you handle one, you know how to handle them. It's the scope and the communications plan that is critical to the success of it.
Yeah. I thought, just to give props, like Mr. Alice, who was our, kind of the heading up stuff with the Deputy Undersecretary of Management. I thought, between that and the Secretary in the White House, you guys definitely were all over it. And it was interesting as, we all bring different skill sets into, our service. And all of a sudden, like Super Karen came out. I was like, what the heck? Where'd this come from? You and I were solving basic fundamental IT and modernization issues. And then I could tell that you had been through something like this before. And I think it was very much appreciated at the department with your experience to kind of help keep us, I wouldn't say calm, but just making sure that we're being methodical and that we've put a process in place to be able to handle it.
Yeah, and you dealt a lot with the attorneys.
Yeah.
And so you know how the attorneys are at any department or agency. And so it was pretty fascinating. Actually, even after I left, there was a whole series of questions that we were still getting as it related to that. Did we do this? Did we do this? And they're like, what are you talking about? We already, this was all done within days. And they had all the documentation and everything. But like I said, I think the biggest thing was they had to have confidence that we knew what we were doing. They're called TikToks in DC, right? So it's minute by minute by minute of the activities you're going to do, and when you're and how you're going to do them, and who's all involved in those. So we had to coordinate what we were doing within the department, and then with the White House, and then with OMB and the other agencies, and then we had a technical team underway. I do remember the one thing Mr. Ellis said, well, why haven't you brought the chief information officers together? And I said, because we haven't solidified the implementation plan. And he said, okay, but this is their staff. And I said, yes, I know. But the minute we tell them, I said, it's going to be in the press, and we want to make sure we're executing our plan. And he said, oh, are you serious? I said, I bet you 45 minutes from the minute we have the conference call to tell them it's in the press, 45 minutes. And he said, okay. So we had this little bet going. And we told him on that Monday morning, and I think it was maybe less than 45 minutes it hit the press that DHS was also compromised by SolarWinds. So yeah, he was like, "Oh, you were right," and I was like, "Yeah, I know." But we were executing out on the plan, so we were in good shape.
Yeah. Karen, just to kind of switch gears a little bit. So, you and I finished our service and are doing different things. And like I said in the beginning, I recognize, we both are kind of cut from a cloth of really trying to kind of give back. I know back in California, I'm involved with a lot of different philanthropic groups and try to kind of help and give back. And here in DC, I was just really impressed. You were like, "Hey, Troy, here's some of the organizations we can get involved with to help." And, like we talked about earlier on, the Partnership for Public Service was a great one. You had kind of nominated me to be on that board. And, it's really interesting is that on the Partnership for Public Service, there really are 2 or 3 different types of personas. There's people like yourself that have been in SDS, so deep government experience, have been on the political side or being appointed, and then out and then back in again. And so because I think once you get out too, you realize I don't know, you kind of stay tuned in, because now when you've been in the center of it, and I think that type of experience when you get new executives coming in as an advisor, and I know you're on the CIO side, I'm on the CFO. And then the other type of profile you would get was people that maybe had done a tour of duty in government, like myself, that I don't have the 20 years of federal experience. And just, I'm not trying to belittle myself, but I know that when I got confirmed and I was in the job, technically I knew the job, and I'm a numbers and finance guy, but I do think that the government, the SDS experience is invaluable. And, and so there's a part of me, like, I think my help to that organization is to get people like myself that want to come in and really make a difference, set realistic expectations of what you can do, leverage. I think the one thing that you taught me at the very beginning when you came in is like, I maybe because we're not like the policy people doing TV stuff and trying to get out there, we're in trying to make sure that organizations are running right. I found the relationships with the career people to be unbelievably helpful and great people, like the dedicated to the service. Like, you'd always kind of hear these perspectives of like, what is the government service or the swamp or whatever. I just did not see that. And I think, when you came in and you're like, "Hey, Troy, I was in those jobs," and it just seemed like there was a really good dynamic at DHS for all the negative stuff you hear in the press, and all these polarizing things that you hear that happens as a mission. The people in there seem to be just really solid, and I wanted to kind of bring that to the Partnership for Public Service as coming in, that perspective. And I'd say I'm probably more the minority. I'm not a DC-based person that's been here. I don't know what your perspective is on that.
Well, first off, don't belittle yourself. I think your views, because you're not so inside DC, are invaluable to that group. I like to think, because I live in West Virginia, it keeps me grounded about what's really important to the American people, right? And it's 99 miles outside of DC. But it's still like, baseball and football and Little League and all those other things like that make it important. So those perspectives are important, because I think people who live too close here in DC lose some of the aspects of what's important. So I also think that the way when new political appointees come in, which is exactly what the Partnership for Public Service works with, is setting realistic expectations for them about what they can actually accomplish, and then for them to think about how to break it out in small enough milestones that they can get the achievements and not be totally frustrated and quit. Mm-hmm. Because their viewpoints are important. And when they get totally frustrated and quit, that's when you start hearing people talk about the swamp and the bureaucracy and things like that. And is it, I call them the weebies. And people say, "Well, what's that?" It's like, we be here when you be gone. Mm-hmm. So you're really appealing to their public service when you come in. They have to know that you have the same goals as they do, and then they'll take the hill for you, which is what you saw at DHS, right? The common mission, you saw that. But if you get a leader in there, people, it doesn't matter if you're in the government or you're in private industry. If you're all about yourself, then your people know you're about yourself, and they're not going to run up that hill with you. They're not going to take the flag. And you want people, like I had people say, Karen, I'm not quite sure where we're going, but I know you know that, and I know it's going to be a good outcome, so I'm going with you. I've had people tell me that, and then that really scares me because I'm like, man, I better be good.
Yeah, that's a lot of responsibility.
That's a lot of responsibility. But I better make sure that this is the right outcome, and that if I'm wrong, I'm the one who's going to take the hit, not the people who believe in me and are following me.
It was interesting, Karen, as we got towards the end of our time, obviously a little bit of a contested transition. Again, being a business person and a continuity person, I've done a lot of Fortune 500 restructuring where people have to be calm through the process. There's too much at stake. One of the things that attracted me to the Partnership for Public Service is we started to have to set up 6 months before the election a transition team to deal with whatever would happen. And at first it felt a little unnatural. It's like, wait, we're not going anywhere yet. We have no idea if we are going. The partnership was actually publishing documents, setting up meetings during calm times, like just trying to get everybody, conditioned for what was coming. And I thought, from a presidential transition viewpoint, probably no better public service, to have a peaceful transfer of power, to be able to make sure with so much at stake, especially in the state of the global economy, the state of the global and military and geopolitical issues, it was refreshing, and I think a lot of the stuff that we would hear in the news about, hey, we're fighting this process from being in the administration, is I thought there was a lot of really good, mature business people, including Emily, who was over, at GSA running really the kind of the key of the transition. And I think, we went through that process and tried to make sure that we had a really good transition. And I'm working with Biden's folks when they first started coming in and just really trying to kind of make sure that, hey, they got it. Like I was documenting everything, meeting with the people, just to make sure that with so much at stake. But I don't know what your perspective, you've been through this a couple of times, and I think you were possibly even on the front end of the transition that came in there. Could you share a little bit about that? So
transitions are fun. I do. I think they're fun. And I was in the Bush administration when the Obama administration was coming in. So we started working on transition. Like you said, laws changed. So now you can start working on transition the minute that there is a candidate. Once there's a candidate on both sides, they can start working on transition and get federal dollars. So that's what you saw with the Partnership for Public Service, and that was the piece associated with that, which is awesome, right? Because you don't want people to come in after the inauguration and say, okay, what do we do now? Right. You want to have the plan. You have key roles that you need to fill that have to get through Senate confirmation. So I worked on several transitions going in, but I worked on the Bush transition going out. That was it. President Bush took us out into the Rose Garden. When you hear that story, that's true. Yep. And he taught to all of us and said, okay, that was, the first economic hard times, right? Too big to fail, all those things. He said, this will be the best transition that'll go down in history. I don't care what anybody says. You do your job to make sure that who's coming in behind you, that it's seamless. And, so I had that White House stuff. I had things documented there saying it's not appropriate for me to make this decision because of the implications associated with it. We had everything ready to go, right? Like 2 different things, and transitioned this stuff out. And I was even working with the White House administration team, because you had to have the White House website flipped the minute President Obama set his hand and said, I do. Yeah. You had to have them flip, right? And it was pretty fascinating to listen to some of the career staff oh yeah, like it might work. I said, well, did we call the service providers across the nation and
Right.
tell them to flush the caches so that the minute that these go, the two go, and they have to hit the White House website. So there was a lot that goes on behind the scenes. So, what you read in the press, like they have to do that.
Yeah.
Like they have to do that. I do think coming in, when we came in the Trump administration, there was a lot of work that was also done. That was an interesting transition team as well. And we started working on stuff in July, right after the convention. And we were working on different things. And you would go up to a certain point to like what you said, because you didn't know who was actually going to win the election. I can tell you that on the Trump team, there was like maybe one of us handling cyber at the time, one of us, handling management issues. When I looked at the Clinton team, there was like 150 people handling cyber. So we were kind of like, holy smokes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it was a little disparate, but it worked. And then, on the way out, you did the same thing I did. We had plans because I'm all about like the email has to work. They have to get their computers. They have to have, make sure that their badges work in their computers, that they get email. Like all of that has to work. And they don't care, who it is. No. And so you just have to make it work.
Yeah, it was a great experience. And it, it's definitely one that I see the Partnership for Public Services are kind of, getting ready. And it's not a bellwether of anything to come for anybody that's in current office or nothing. It's just like you said, it's a process that has to be done. Hey, Karen, just going through kind of in closing as we kind of, talk through a lot of the different areas of your career and advancing from IT and cyber and into the administration and your current work in the market. Anything that you would like to leave with the listeners or anything that to think about from your perspective that you think might be helpful for them?
Well, I do think that when people start looking at what can I do to make a difference, you should really like say, I can make a difference. I'm going to leave with this one little story, which was my husband and I were at Applebee's. We used to go out for dinner before COVID every Thursday. And I was being asked, because I had a really great private practice going, I had a nonprofit going, I was, in venture capital, I was doing all kinds of stuff. And I was asked to take over this role at Department of Energy on the energy, cyber, grid, all of that stuff. Yep. And my husband says, why in the world would you do that? And I looked at him and I said, if you knew you had the skill set to do the job and make a difference, why wouldn't I do it?
Right.
And he looked at me and he goes, okay, gosh, if you're going to put it like that, then you need to go in. Okay, fine. And that was the end of the discussion. So I really think people need to look at what are the possibilities and how I can make a difference, and then they need to pursue it. Because I think everybody has the skill sets to do it. And a lot of it, like you said, is knowing the right people and then connecting, right? Like, so I'm all about being a connector. I feel like I'm not a doer, but people say I'm a doer. I like to think I'm a connector and trying to connect people so that we can accomplish great results for the American people.
Yeah. Well, Karen, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate the opportunity of getting back together. And I know you're always on the road too. I think it's been, you and I have been trying to get together for a bit. And I'm just very grateful for the relationship and for the mentoring that you've provided me. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share. I always like sharing my stories. So thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. Well, you have a good evening. And I look forward to meeting up with you again. Thanks, Karen. Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.